guys, and welcome to today's video where we'll be comparing leopard and crested geckos, as I am often asked to help people decide which one to get. Now, I think I did a video like this years and years ago, but I figured I'd do a bit of an update and also a new twist on it. So throughout this video I will be asking you questions that may help you decide which gecko suits you best. Now we're going to be covering setup, environment, diet, handling and health. Now of course this won't be a full-blown care guide for each of the geckos, but I literally have hundreds of videos on each of these geckos and they are organised into playlists, so you can easily find the videos you are looking for. Of course though, I do have my retrieve care guides, so if you want to find what you're looking for straight away, you can easily type in a keyword or a question and it will take you straight to the video. I will link them below because I know especially people with leopard geckos may find them really helpful. Also, I have done videos comparing handling and documenting a day in the life of owning each of these geckos, so I will leave links to those videos below. So first let's start off with our first set of questions. Do you have access to a decent breeder or shop? Do you have access to an exotic vet? And have you done your research? So of course the first one, purely down to you where you want to buy your gecko from, but what we ideally want to do is avoid supporting big chain pet stores that don't treat their animals the best. Now, I know in some cases this is your only option, fair enough, but don't forget you can find breeders online who may ship to you. You might be able to go to expos, you might be able to rehome geckos, so there are a few options where we don't have to support bad shops. The second point, do you have access to an exotic vet, is super important. It makes me so angry when someone comes to me saying their gecko is sick, but there is no exotic vet in their area. You should know this before getting a gecko. And though both geckos are considered fairly hardy, that doesn't mean you can skip over this point. Things can go wrong, and if you haven't properly researched a gecko and they receive improper care, the likelihood of having to see a vet just goes up. And also, if you're trying to convince your parents to let you have a gecko, do not tell them that your gecko will never need to go to the vet, because when that time comes, or if that time comes, your parents have the control. They can turn around and say, we can't afford it, I'm not taking you, and yeah, it's super mean, super irresponsible, but just be upfront with your parents, because sure, these geckos are hardy, and some of my geckos have never been to the vets, but that doesn't mean they'll never have to. And finally, have you done your research? So of course, before making any decision, you should do a ton of research. After all, these geckos can live over 20 years, so they're a big commitment. So with those questions out of the way, let's look at the first topic, setup. So my question to you is, which do you prefer? An arboreal forest-like setup or an arid setup? Because you may be looking at this tank for a couple of decades, so you want to definitely pick one that you would prefer, or you might be like me and you like both, so this really doesn't help. So I guess the biggest thing that can determine which setup is suitable for you, or what you might prefer, is size and cost. Now size wise, the minimum for an adult crested gecko is 45 by 45 by 60 centimeters, so that's a taller tank. Minimum for a leopard gecko I'd say is about 60 centimeters long, so the footprint of these tanks is only about 15 centimeters in it, so not much. But of course, if you do choose to upgrade, a leopard gecko tank tends to get longer, whereas a crested gecko tank tends to get taller. So what's your preference? Price wise, it can really vary on what you want to achieve out of the tank. Like, do you want a live planted tank? Do you want to provide heat in UV? Because I'd say heat in UV is kind of a must with leopard geckos, and though I would recommend heat and UV for a crested gecko, some people see this more as an option rather than a necessity. So with crested geckos, although I don't fully agree with it, some people will skip over getting electronic equipment for their tank. I would definitely recommend, you know, a heater for autumn and winter and stuff like that, and they definitely can benefit from UV. So unfortunately there isn't a real big difference in terms of price and size of the setup. It really depends how much you want to invest in it. So I guess the biggest thing here is your personal preference on what kind of environment you want to create. Do you want that like forest environment, or do you want that arid environment? Speaking of environment, let's look at your environment. So do you live in a place that's quite hot or quite dry? If your answer is yes, then a Crested Gecko might not be for you unless you have aircon and you're constantly spraying down the tank. So Crested Geckos need high humidity, though it can drop during the day, and they can't really tolerate temperatures over 82 degrees Fahrenheit. They can have heat stroke. Whereas leopard geckos, they have a basking area of 90 degrees. They don't require high humidity, but they do need a temperature gradient in their tank. So the whole tank can't be 90 degrees. You do need a cooler side. What I have found though, because England can be quite humid at times, with a leopard gecko, if you have a well ventilated tank and you have, say, like the deep heat projector, despite it being humid outside, it dries out the tank a lot better. So if you do live in quite a humid area, there are ways around it with the leopard gecko. But with crested geckos, if your temperatures are constantly hot or you're living in a really dry area, it could be quite difficult to maintain them. I know someone who lived in a really dry area and they gave up on their crested gecko a few months in because it was a complete task every day keeping the humidity up. So that's something to consider. And also, if you live in a place that gets quite cold in like autumn or winter, even year round, and you were going to choose a crested gecko because the setup might be cheaper because you didn't have to buy equipment, don't do that. If you live in a cold place, you're going to definitely need a heater. You want to set it at maybe around 75 degrees Fahrenheit. It doesn't seem like much, but it can make a massive difference to your animal. Next up is diet. So are you allowed to keep a variety of insects, and do you have easy access to buying feeder insects? If you said no to both of these, then a leopard gecko isn't for you. Leopard geckos require a variety of feeders, and those feeders require care too. And I would highly recommend offering your crested gecko insects. Technically, you can keep them on exclusively like Pangea or Reptile diet, but I would definitely recommend insects. Now, feeding wise, of course, with say Pangea, you just add water, you mix it up, put it in the tank, leave it for a day, remove it. Super quick, super easy. With leopard geckos, when offering feeder insects, obviously those insects have to be gut loaded beforehand. You have to handle those insects to pop them in your bag or your pot, wherever you're going to be dusting them in. Make sure your gecko eats them, remove any uneaten insects after 24 hours, and sometimes, of course, insects can escape. So I guess, yeah, it probably takes a little more time and effort to feed a leopard gecko. Also, say you were going on holiday and you needed someone to look after your gecko, I'm sure they'd prefer to mix a powdered diet than dealing with insects. So that's another thing to consider. Obviously, whenever you're getting a pet, you have to kind of think, if I go away for a bit, who's going to look after them? Will they tolerate like all these feeder insects and stuff like that? I think also with crested geckos, there's a lot less to think about with their diet, since the pre-made ones like Pangea have fairly decent vitamin and mineral balances. So you don't have to think things through as much like when you're feeding leopard geckos and you have to think about gut loading the food and dusting it. Next up, handling. So would you like a gecko that will sit and chill on your arm when you're watching TV? If the answer is yes, then maybe a leopard gecko is for you. But of course, young leopard geckos can be more skittish and quicker, and I would say your leopard gecko being fast and moving around a lot and not settling isn't a bad thing either. It just probably means it's fully energized. I think if a gecko is more sluggish, that's more of a concern. However, what I have found is leopard geckos, once they're comfortable, once they've had a walk around, they do tend to lower their little bellies on your arm because it's nice and warm, and they'll just sort of settle and you can sit with them for a bit. However, with crested geckos, they are more likely to sort of walk, run, jump. I personally love both ways, and technically Lyra, my crested gecko, will sort of settle. She's not always running, she's not always jumping, but I'd say she's probably more likely to poop on me if she gets settled. And as I said at the beginning, I do have a video where I compare what it's like to handle leopard geckos, crested geckos and chihuahuas. So if handling is a topic you'd like to explore more, then that video may help. Also, if you're able to, if you're curious like what they feel like, what it's like to handle them, and you're able to access like a reptile shop, maybe you could ask if you could handle the geckos beforehand, see what you prefer. And finally, we have health. So do you have money set aside to see a vet if and when you need to? If the answer is no, then neither of these geckos are for you. As I said at the beginning, both geckos are considered pretty hardy, but things can go wrong, and I can't definitively say one type of gecko is going to be healthier than the other. One thing I'll say, and this is purely just from my experience, what I've observed, and this can definitely vary from gecko to gecko, but female leopard geckos tend to stress me out a little more over the egg laying season since they lose so much weight and they go off their food. Whereas Lyra, my crested gecko, when she's about to lay eggs, she just eats more, usually more insects, lays one clutch and gets on with her day. Like, her weight is also pretty consistent year round, whereas the leopard geckos, the female leopard geckos, will drop quite drastically and then return to normal. It's hard to compare the two as a whole, as health can be determined by such a range of things, but I guess this section is in here to be like, make sure you have access and funds to an exotic vet. There were other things I could include, like appearance, which gecko do you prefer, but that's so subjective I couldn't compare. Like, I love them both and that has nothing really to do on your decision too much, really. But I hope this video has helped. It might have actually made things more complicated, but if you still are really stuck on which one to get, just remember, like, you could get a leopard gecko now, and a few years down the line, you can get a crested gecko. Like, if you're a reptile person, it's likely you won't only have one reptile your entire life. I'm pretty sure that's unheard of in our hobby. So don't worry, you know, you have time. You don't have to go out and get a leopard gecko and a crested gecko at the same time, and just enjoy the animals you have and make a choice on what animal you're really passionate about. But yeah, if you want more videos about leopard geckos and crested gecko care, be sure to subscribe. And if you want to support this channel, please check out my Patreon. But thank you for watching, guys, and goodbye.